Hello and welcome to Atmosoft Tech Talks, a live show where we discuss everything you need to know about software development and technology in business. I'm Natasha, your host, and joining me today is Brandon, one of our developers at Atmosoft, and our COO, Bill, who's a solutions architect at Atmosoft. Hi, welcome everyone. How are you guys
Hello,
doing?
thanks for having us.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just jump into it. Today, we're going to be talking about more documentation questions and about your guys' experience with documenting. So let's just dive right into our first question, which is documentation is often seen as time consuming. How can we manage time effectively when it comes to documenting projects? Bill, I'll let you go first.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so when we talk about documentation and we talk about obviously everything that we're doing there's work involved, right? So work we're spending money, and so we need to be considerate of the boundaries of the overall cost of the project. So when looking at documentation, my thing is to I always schedule it. So like as one of the tasks to do in a feature, or one of the tasks to do in the project, I set aside a little bit of time for documentation. I was speaking with Brendan earlier, and he was talking about kind of when to do documentation and that kind of stuff. And the conversation we were having around was really good because when you want to do documentation, I think at the beginning you're going to do documentation that's going to be more of an outline overall kind of project scope, what you're going to do, what are the features, maybe you're going to document out your user stories and different aspects of the project that you're going to work on in development. And then as you proceed into what I call kind of the hardcore development phase, documentation should minimize a little bit, right? Because the system is going to be changing so rapidly that just scheduling time at that point to do the documentation is just going to be an ongoing effort anyway. I like to, as the code starts to stabilize, the structure stabilizing, then we kind of pay more attention to documentation and generate kind of what the final output of the documentation would look like there. So that's kind of the approach that I take. I know a lot of people don't like to do documentation, and that's okay. But at some point we have to work on what is our systemic communication, what is our project communication, what does that look like? We have other people that are interested and need to understand what we're doing, and that's the purpose of documentation. Also, we mentioned the other day that documentation kind of helps get other people that are new to the project up to speed and understanding. What I really like to document is overall structure, overall kind of feature set, document the API and what the intended uses for the API endpoints are, and then from there you can either go more or less depending on how your organization wants to handle it. But at a minimum, people need to be able to get the large scope of the system and some details on some of the internal structures or modules in the system. I think at that point you've documented fairly enough. And again, you could do more, but I think at a minimum, you need to give people a broad overview and then kind of dive down the details a little bit. But I don't agree with I've worked for companies before that want you to basically document every line of code. Like, I added a new function. Here's what the function does. Here's what the parameters do, and everything else like that. That code is in a way self-documenting. I think it gets better when you add comments, but you don't really need to go down to that level because to be honest with you, nobody's gonna read that. No,
Yeah.
if I'm reading code in a document, I'm just gonna go look at the code,
Yeah,
and I'll
exactly.
get the latest version of whatever's going on. What do you think,
Yeah,
Brandon?
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tosh.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say, yeah, most of the time, if the documentation is going to someone who already knows and understands the language of code that the code is in, so they don't need to know every specific thing. It's just like a general overview to help them speed up and catch up.
Yeah, like an example would be an inventory service, right? This is our inventory management service that does all the inventories for whatever widgets we're selling or whatever. A high level overview of there is this module that takes care of inventory. There is a service related that takes care of inventory. If you're doing anything with inventory, you should use the service, and here are the features available in that service. I think it's plenty documentation that way.
Yeah, Brandon, would you like to add anything?
So I agree with you about how like you should just schedule time for documentation. That's how to like manage the time. But I also think that it's beneficial to have like a structure or like a template for how your documentation should go. That can speed it up a lot. because I know, at least personally, when I do documentation, a lot of it is confused about like the formatting of how I should document stuff. And so if there's
Yes.
like a general company structure of how you're supposed to format it, then that can speed it up a lot.
So it's kind of like the code review document
Yeah.
that we reviewed yesterday, right? You have it. I have a new project. We're working on some new non-existing. It's a completely new project. We're working on a new project or a new subsystem or something like that. And here's the organizational template. That's a great idea. Here's the
Yeah.
organizational template of what we would like you to cover for that particular project and the areas we would like you to hit. And it kind of defines it. Kind of, instead of having this nebulous document everything kind of thing, it kind of gives you some boundaries on what the documentation look like. That's an excellent idea. We should do a template for that as well.
Yeah, I actually
agree,
have
yeah.
one kind of already in the works, so maybe I'll make it so that it's accessible like the code review template, and then we can
Yeah.
release it on our LinkedIn page as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, fantastic. Awesome idea. So make sure you're following our page if you are interested in that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. How important is it to keep documentation updated? And what's the best way to manage this?
Okay, so from my perspective, we touched on it a little bit before. I think the template is a great idea, and I think scheduling the time for documentation is important. It depends on the level of importance of documentation for an organization. I think no documentation is a mistake. I think documenting every line of code is a mistake. So you got to find this good middle ground based on your organization. I think the best way to do that is just basically to understand that, if I'm doing a task or a feature, or I'm working on a board item, and that board item, is going to take the whole entire sprint, whatever the length of the sprint is, and I don't schedule any time for documentation, then expecting documentation to be done when the actual work of implementing that feature is going to take the full sprint is kind of unrealistic. So I've worked in teams that have done this, where we do a full sprint of work, and then maybe half of another sprint where we go back and we update and do documentation. The problem with documentation is it's not a living document, and so it continually has to be updated as things change. And a lot of times teams will get in kind of a frenzied state because they're trying to hit a deadline, or they're trying to get all their stuff done, and documentation is the first thing that's going to go out the window. As soon as you get pressed for time, documentation is the first thing to go. That's why I like to do the initial structure up front. This is what we were thinking. Wait until the code base and the feature set kind of stabilizes a little bit. You're doing more bug fixes and tweaking, trying to get everything just right down to the line, and then you start scheduling documentation time. That kind of takes into consideration that compression of time that's going to happen in the middle of developing something, because we all have deadlines, we all have things that we have to meet, and so documentation is going to be the first one to go as soon as you feel time pressure.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add, Brian?
I was going to say, like, with the bug fixes and stuff, we were talking just a little bit earlier about how we shouldn't have to document like every line of code.
Mhm.
So with bug fixes, I would say we only have to change documentation or update documentation when there are like structural changes to how the project functions. And if you're just updating or fixing a bug or changing a like function slightly, then you don't really need to update the documentation at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. If you're like pressed for time, you're not going to do documentation until after.
Yep.
Yeah.
That can kind of, the after thing, it's not really a mistake, but it's also going to be, it's also, you usually feel rushed in that time. So like if we're done and we're about to deliver, and we were under extreme time pressure, maybe we wanted to get something out before a conference, or we wanted to get a major update out before a competitor, and we're very compressed for time, like the timeline cannot shift, and so we left documentation. And then when you come back to that documentation, and you're looking at 2 weeks of documentation, a lot of developers will just kind of rush through it to try to get it done, and I don't think you get things documented as well as you could if you keep documentation at the forefront. And then you also need to have the idea around, why are we documenting, right? If there's no valid business reason to document, like, you don't need to worry about maintenance in the future. Maybe your app's very short-lived. Maybe it's just you're doing it again for a conference, and once conference is over, the app's going to go away. I wouldn't document that at all. Documentation is more for historical record, and to bring new team members up to speed, and to provide to the stakeholders that want the application or developed, and so they can review and kind of understand where they're at. We as a consulting company use documentation for the purpose of communication, because at the end of our project we're done, and we're gonna walk away. And when we walk away, we want any company that's working with us to be able to fully support. You get all the code, you get everything that all the assets that we developed for you during your project, and then we're going to give you a little binder of documentation so that if you don't want to call us back in the future and you want to just handle it yourself, we came in, we showed you how to do it, we set everything up, and you just want to tweak this one little thing and maybe an Azure function that we deployed, then the documentation is available for your team to review and be like, okay, that's the function I need to change, and here's best practices around that and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the main thing for our documentation is it's kind of when you buy like a blender or something and you're like, okay, now that I've bought it, I don't want to have to call someone in every time my blender has an issue. We want to give you a manual. So if it's like a pretty easy troubleshooting issue, you can just look at it and be like, it's making a weird noise, and find the weird noise section and then fix it yourself.
Yeah. Yep. Self-help.
Yep. Do you have anything you want to add, Brandon?
Nope.
Okay, let's move on to our next question then. Agile development is all about moving quickly. How does documentation fit into this methodology?
Okay, so this question is a trick question, and I'll tell you why. The original Agile Manifesto specifically states that we want communication over documentation. The reason for that is the reasons that we've gone over all week. Basically, is developers don't want to write documentation; it's boring. And maybe you have a technical writer, which is helpful. So that's also something to consider if you want things extremely documented and you need end user documentation. A technical writer is a very good hire. And but most developers don't want to do documents. So when Agile came out and was first starting to get popular and get adopted, they really pushed kind of the no document route. So if you go back in developmental history, I've been around for a while, and we look at what we had before Agile, it was something called waterfall. And so waterfall was this project management methodology where we did this. We documented everything before we wrote a line of code. We documented the systems. We documented the interactions. We documented everything. This big, huge project scope took weeks, and then we would, after we were done with that analysis phase and all the documentation around that, we would go into our developer holes for 6 months and then come back out, and then the business would be like, this isn't what we asked for, or, oh, business changed and now we need to do this. And then you would do the whole waterfall process again, and then you would go back in the hole, and then you would come out. It just wasn't an effective management strategy. But I think where Agile kind of missed the mark a little bit, and I used to be in the camp of no documentation. I really was like, let's just not do it. But as I've gotten older and aged in my career, I've started to realize some of the benefits of doing this work, and try to find ways to incorporate it into my process without, kind of breaking Agile, so to speak. Because what we want to do, if me and Brandon are working on something, is we want to talk about it, and then we want to have a conversation, then we get a rough idea of what we're going to do, and then we go do some work, and then we meet back up and we have another discussion. And not all those discussions need to be documented. So again, you need to set up a goal for your documentation, and then when you have a goal and objective for your documentation, you schedule time as because this is an artifact of your project. Not only is your code or you're deployed in production, this can be an artifact of your system, and so you need to schedule time to make sure that gets done correctly, and you don't always want to do it at the end. So I fall now more in the middle ground of, yeah, I agree with Agile, and yeah, I agree with documentation. And so I try to find a good solid middle ground, because I think Agile would lean towards, no, let's not document, and not entirely, but that's what the manifesto says. That's the goal, right? Communication over documentation. And so where I land is kind of in the middle. It's maybe we don't need to do as much as we did before, but we also don't need to do none.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything you want to add, Brandon?
No, I agree with Bill, mostly.
Oh, yeah. Sounds good. Let's move on to the next question then. What are the consequences of poor or missing documentation?
Okay, so for example, one client that we worked with, and we're in as consultants, this is standard business practice. So I'm not saying that we're transitioning out. That is what we're supposed to do as consultants. We come in, we solve a problem, we stabilize the system, we do whatever work is required, and then at some point the consultancy part of that is done, and the company, you know, moves on. That's just a normal flow for business. So when we got there, there was zero documentation. So it was all code, and it was all database and a bunch of random processes running all over the place, modifying and changing data. And the problem, what happens is the company ends up paying more for us to come in and figure it out, right? Like hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of us looking at code. Okay, think it's doing this, trying to find some errant process on some random machine that's randomly toggling some data in the database because somebody before us didn't document it. The other thing is too is some of the code that they're running did not make it into source control, and so there's processes out there that, you know, basically the only way, and this takes even longer, the only way we could figure out what was going on was for me to decompile it using just decompile, and then figure out the IL. And it wasn't as bad as IL because the decompiler tools actually give you some, you know, C# syntax. So I wasn't having to read a bunch of IL, but that is confusing code that it generates, like weird anonymous function calls and, you know, hexadecimal digits and variables named A, B, C, D, E, and you're like, okay, E is doing what? And so in order to figure out what the program was doing so it could replicate it, we had to decompile it. So if we would have had documentation around, this is the app, this is how it was supposed to work, this is what it was doing in this particular case, it would have saved the company a lot of time or a lot of money to not have us come in and have to come figure it out. So that's the biggest one that I could see immediately is there will be a cost later, and that cost could be as severe as none of the original developers are available to ask questions, and so now you have to pay for someone else to come in and figure that code out or decompile that code and figure it out, which, you know, I'll be honest with you, there's probably not a ton of people that can, I'm sure they can look at the decompiled code, but it confused me. Like I know a lot, and I would never write code the way that decompiled, but that's what the compiler does, right? So we're looking at compiler output and trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? It's not always intuitively obvious.
Yeah, it seems like it's kind of the difference between reading a book and then like looking at like hieroglyphs that you might not have all the easy like translations for. So it's like the difference between being able to just quickly read something and understand it, and then having to translate it on the other side with the decompiler, and maybe not being able to translate all of it because you just can't. Like,
Yep.
Brandon, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of say what Bill said. Like, it's just it would increase costs because it's like going in blind, and then you have to reverse engineer how the app works, and then before you can do any work on it. And especially with certain projects, like how the original developers wrote it, there could have been different like paradigms or conventions at the time that are confusing now. And like a lot of the naming conventions, if it's not documented, can be hard to decipher.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like it's like being able to, like, if you could directly talk to them, that would be one thing, but instead you're now being hired by a company that probably wants new features very quickly, and you're like, okay, well, I need a minute to just understand what I'm working with because there's nothing to tell
By
me
a minute,
what
I mean
that
like
is.
a few months.
Like
You don't know, like maybe you track something down and you think it's okay. I think this is reading from this table and it's doing this XYZ thing, and a lot of the business's logic is incorporated in there, right? And if you have this app that's running okay but not perfectly, and it needs to be updated because, you know, some new thing, in this particular case, it would be some, like we added new widgets to our stock, and so this app, you know, would need to understand what these new widgets are and how to process the widgets and turn them into orders and invoices and that kind of thing, and it's just not there. And so if you, when you go in and the business is running and it's kind of critical component that they're running with, and you don't fully grasped with even the original source code about what are the business rules right here, right? And so you take your best guess and then you're wrong. And then the business starts like, oh my gosh, you just imported all this stuff and now we have like 50,000 lines that we have to figure out how to delete out of the the accounting system or the production systems or something like that, because there was this small business rule that you didn't know, and no one wrote down that, hey, the requirement is it has to process it like this and break it out into these things, and you didn't understand that rule because it wasn't obvious. And so yeah, you run into those problems quite a bit. It's okay, it's a problem you can solve, but realize if you don't do the documentation up front, or at least have a high level overview and some standards and everything in place, eventually you're going to be forced into that position at a cost of 2, 3, 4 times as much as it would have cost you just to say, hey, can you write this down? Like just put it in a wiki, put it up on SharePoint, put it in OneNote, just put it down. I mean, like I said, one of our clients, we spent me and another developer spent like the first 4 months just making sure that we understood everything that was going on. I mean, we were doing other work too, but our primary goal and objective was just to get in and get it written down so that someone else could understand what's going on.
And to add to that is like, along with the business rules, is also like a lot of the time the original developers will make certain decisions that you like wouldn't have made, and then you need to understand like why, like you need to figure out why they made that decision, and if you like revert it or do what you would have done in that situation, if it's going to break everything.
yeah, that's a great point. I love that point, because that happens a lot. Like you look at the code and you're like, why? And
exactly.
And you know what my first reaction is? I need to figure this out, like why they did this. Like it looks wrong. It looks totally wrong. Like it looks like you shouldn't do this.
Yeah, exactly. But then a lot of the time you go through it and figure
like,
out
what were they thinking? Like, why would they do it like this? Like, and you just sit there and you're just like, okay, I really. And then I don't know if you guys are like me. I've lost sleep over questions like that. I'm like, I'm not sure if I made
in the same way.
choice.
I always am like, I need to figure out why they did this, because like it feels like there's a better way to do it. And then a lot of the time in the investigation, I'll figure out like there's a specific reason why they wanted it to function the way that they did and why they did what they did. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I have to either figure out an alternate way to do this or just kind of leave it alone.
Yep.
Yeah, and
I want to add one more point based off of what Brandon said. You can also end up in this situation where new developers come in, right? And you got the system, and there's this one part that you're not supposed to touch. You can never touch this subsystem. Don't modify any of the code. It does exactly what it's supposed to do, and we don't understand how it works, but it works. And you're not supposed to touch it. You never want to be in that situation. All your code should be editable, modifiable, and you should have a clear vision of what that particular subsystem's inputs and outputs are. But you never want to end up in the situation of don't touch the invoicing subsystem. Touch one line of code, everything will break. And I think you get in that situation when things aren't documented and communicated for future people. And when you write documentation, you're also talking to your future self. Bill, 20 minutes in the future, or 6 months in the future, may need to remember why he made this decision back here, because now this code looks really bad. And you're like, whoa, I should fix this. And you're like, wait a minute, Bill. What did past Bill say about this?
Yeah, I was just going to add that documentation also doesn't have to be a huge document that you're filling out. It could be something as simple as putting comments when you realize that you're doing something that maybe you wouldn't originally do, and you're just putting a comment of, I know this looks weird, but this is why we did it.
Yeah. I leave notes for myself like that in the code all the time. And there are tools actually that will extract all the comments out of the code and build kind of a document. I haven't used a ton of them, but I've played around with them. That'll build a document around it. And there's a lot of tools to help you comment, like in Visual Studio, if you do the // it gives you the summary and then auto puts out the parameters. So you could type in like this parameters for this and this does this. That's kind of nice. And I think ReSharper has some features around documentation that make the inside code documentation a little bit better. Like I use to-dos all the time. Like I have a to-do checklist, and I'll just be like, I'm going to write this code right now, but I need to go back and fix this later. I just want to finish this one thing. This is what I'm to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if, I don't know much about GitHub Copilot, but do you know if they use like AI for any documentation stuff for GitHub Copilot?
For GitHub Copilot, I think so. Yeah, I think it's all AI driven. I'm not sure. I think you can get it to produce. I haven't tried this. I'll have to test it out, but I think you can get it to produce basically an explanation of what the code is doing if you use the actual window in like I use Visual Studio. If you use the actual window of Visual Studio, you can have it, explain what this function is doing, and then you could turn that into a comment.
Yeah. I was just wondering because it seems like something that AI could be put into, and that could be
Yeah,
like very useful.
yeah. I mean, I've gone back through projects and just added, basically the whole day was spent just adding / summary. This function does this.
Yep.
Here's what the parameters are for, and just to clean up the code a little bit.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So are
Sure.
you guys ready for the last question?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so the last question for today is for those who have not been regularly documenting their work, how should they get started?
Start. Seriously.
Yeah,
just write, document something, or you know what? First thing you should do is figure out what one of the other. People are going to yell at me for this because I've heard this both ways. I like putting the specific documentation into a folder inside of the project and checking it in with source control. I really do. I just like having everything contained, and when I go do my pull, I just get everything. And so it's probably not a best practice. It's probably not great for or a larger organization. The first thing you need to do is you guys need to sit down and figure out where are we going to put this that's useful and readily accessible to everybody. Like documentation included inside of the solution is not the best place for everybody in the organization because most people are not going to download Git and pull all the files down. And plus you probably don't want everyone in the organization pulling the code down. But unless it's open source. But anyway, and so just get started. So the first thing I would say, if you haven't done any documentation, is work with your lead. If you are the lead, make a decision. Where are we going to put this? Like where's this? Like SharePoint's great. I really like OneNote. I like Evernote too, but I use OneNote because I already have Office. And I like OneNote, and you could share the notebooks between the teams. And Slack is another thing I think that people use for documentation, if I'm not mistaken. Like you can put documentation up in a Slack channel. Teams, you can create an organizational team and you can put your files in there. And then after you figure out where you want to figure out a structure, like what kind of stuff do we want to document? One of the things I really like, I think it was called, I haven't done it yet, but it's called like an ARS. It is architectural record. Basically we had this design, we developed the system, and we're going to make a change. And so I create this record that is a written record. And I think I got the acronym wrong, but it's a written record of why we made the architectural change. So it's like a journal of your evolving architecture. That to me, I really liked the concept, and that was checked in with the code on the one video that I watched. And I thought it was great because like we're going to, we went from maybe a modular monolith, and now we're going to break everything out into microservices. And I'm adding a little note in a little record in this journal or whatever. I'm going to say, okay, we decided to switch from modular monolith to a microservices architecture, and here's the reason why. And then you can look through all those notes and see what the systemic architectural changes were made and the why of it, which is, it's really important to capture that. You don't want to be making like broad architectural changing decisions without consulting your team and working together as a team and as an organization. And it's good to have those notes. Oh, we switched from this pattern to this pattern because it solved this problem. And then just being able to go through those notes and see how the system evolved kind of gives you a good view of where things were and where they're going. So number one, where, and then what are you going to document? And then just start a tiny document. Find a template, go online, ask ChatGPT to make you a software documentation template. It'll spit something out. You fill in little square brackets, and at least you started.
Yeah. Also, soon we'll have a template for you to use. So download our template, print it out, or put it in OneNote and fill it out.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Brandon, is there something you wanted to say?
The only thing I would add is, as someone who the only tip I can give is like when you start, especially if you are starting on like this huge project, it can feel overwhelming and like you just don't know where to start. Just choose a place, like whatever you know best, document that first, and then just go down from there.
Yeah, maybe just like the page that you've spent the most time in, so you know that you put most of the code in there, and you can just start there because that's what you for sure know, and then move on from that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think you guys had a lot of very good insights, but I'm going to close us out for the day. So that is it from us. Join us next time as we explore more tech topics on Tech Talk with Atmosoft. And remember, stay curious and stay integrated.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.